episode of this. Welcome to another episode of the Centre for Brexit Studies webinar stroke online event series. Today it gives me some pleasure to have a panel of distinguished speakers who are going to talk around greening the economy. Of course, with the urgent challenge posed by climate change, which of course has been obscured by COVID-19 and Brexit. With the urgent challenges posed by climate change and of course the UK hosting the COP26 summit this year, it's certainly coming back into the spotlight. And not that it ever really went away, but of course, as we now look at the threat posed by global warming and the UK government's target of zero net emissions for CO2 by 2050, and of course a revised target by 2035 for a 78% reduction in CO2 emissions. When you think about it, 2035 is only about a decade or so away. So there is a real sense of urgency here. And I would hope in terms of talking to our speakers today and having them air their views with us that we may get some feel as to a sort of scorecard, if you like, for the UK. How is the UK doing in terms of matching the rhetoric of reducing greenhouse gas emissions as opposed to the reality on the ground? So it'll be very interesting to hear our panel's thoughts in those regards. Of course, the environment is one key aspect for government, but as we've seen, the environment can come into conflict with other policy imperatives. For example, the furore, if you like, around the imminent, in all likelihood, trade agreement between the UK and Australia. And of course, one of the key elements of a trade agreement for Australia is to get zero tariffs on Australian agricultural exports, notably here beef and lamb. And of course, many of us would well say, what is the sustainability impact of shipping meat halfway around the planet, leaving aside, of course, certain issues around Australian food standards. But clearly here, reducing a carbon footprint, does pose considerable challenges and may clash with other political imperatives. So it may be interesting to get our panel's thoughts in those regards as well. So in terms of the format of the event then, we have three distinguished speakers today. We have Beverly Nielsen, we have David Bailey, and we have Vicky Price. Now, in terms of the agenda for today, our first speaker is going to be Beverly Nielsen. She'll then be followed by David Bailey, who will then be followed by Vicky Price. Each speaker will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. They each have a presentation. And at the end, then we will have time for audience question and answers. Now, I would invite you to use the chat function to pose any questions that you may have in order to do that, and we can pick them up and then alert our panel members to them. So a bit of basic housekeeping, which I'm terrible at myself, but as the host, I do feel it imperative to remind you all, if you have any mobile phones at or near you, please keep them on silent. Similarly, with any notifications you may have on your computer, it may be necessary to shut down Outlook, for example, to stop it beeping at you. Or otherwise just mute yourself, which would be better. So as an audience participant, please mute your own microphones and keep cameras switched off. That helps in terms of connectivity, I'm told. So I don't need to remind anyone here, that the topic can raise passions in certain areas, but of course on this platform, if anyone posts any objective remarks, offensive remarks, then we do have the prerogative to boot you off the platform, so to speak. But I hope it doesn't come to that, and I don't think it will. So then, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker then is Beverly Nielsen. And now Beverly is an associate professor and executive director at the Institute for Design, Economic Acceleration and Sustainability, otherwise known as IDEAS. And she is also a senior fellow here with us at the Centre for Brexit Studies here at Birmingham City Uni, where she's worked for the past 14 years. And it's very apposite that we have Beverly on to speak today, because she's currently co-editing a book on the green economy with her colleague and fellow CBS fellow, Dr. Steve McCabe, due to be published this June by Bite-sized Books with contributors, including our fellow panelists. So also including Lord Jonathan Porritt, Tony Juniper, of course, Chair of Natural England, Vicky, as mentioned, and David. Chair of West Midlands Energy Capital, Matthew Rhodes, and Margot James from Warwick Manufacturing Group at Warwick Uni, along with representatives from local government and industry. So, why is that? Anyway, So Beverley chairs Ultra Light Rail Partners Limited and has pioneered lightweight, affordable and sustainable transport solutions, and specifically the use of biomethane as a clean circular economy fuel for use in trains, trams, buses and HGVs, trialling and demonstrating a train run on biomethane as a UK first of a kind, which was funded by Innovate UK in 2020. Now, Beverley, I'm going to hand over to you on that note. So again, to remind, about 15 to 20 minutes speaking time, and I would ask everybody else, please, to keep their cameras and microphones switched off. So over to you, please, Beverley.
Thanks so much for those words of introduction, Alex, and a great pleasure to be sharing the panel with fellow speakers. As you indicated, my intention today is to outline the scale of the challenges facing us globally and specifically in the UK, and then to look at a practical alternative. You mentioned very kindly there my involvement with biomethane. I feel it's a very much a lesser known gas, and very little proposed as an alternative solution. So these slides at the beginning are very much setting the scene, and as you can see here, have a big decline during 2019, 2020 as a result of the COVID impact. It was the largest decline since World War II, but actually, unfortunately, the International Energy Agency are now predicting big reversals in these declines. So as you can see in this slide, coal demand is the key driver of the reversal. And whilst in renewables do play a part, it's around 30% of the mix globally. One of the things that I think is often overlooked is that, and as the United Nations Environment Programme highlighted recently, earlier in May, is the role of methane. Methane as a greenhouse gas is actually 4 times more harmful than CO2, often gets overlooked. But actually what the UN said is if we could cut human-caused methane emissions by 45%, it could help us avoid 0.3 degrees of global warming by the 2040s. And I think, as you can see in the last sentence here, the relationship between global warming, productivity, health impacts, and of course others not specified here around biodiversity, mass extinctions, water shortages or flooding is really clear. Now, this is something I did just want to sort of dwell on for a minute, because the notion of a climate budget is something that is being talked about more and more. And the IPPC, along with people such as Tokarska and Matthews here, have come up with ways of actually modeling a global carbon budget. And this particular tool here is the way that they're looking at it, sort of shorthand TCRE, transient climate, cumulative climate relationship. So what this does is they've come up with a sort of cumulative carbon budget for the globe of about 420 to 440 gigatons. And they do say, rather worryingly, that there's already a 1 in 6 chance, 17% chance that we have exceeded the 1.5 C rise in global warming from pre-industrial levels. And you may have heard this morning on the news that there was a piece suggesting that actually there's a 40% chance in the next 5 years that we will actually hit 1.5 C in at least one of those years. So it's clearly a challenge which is nearer rather than further away, with more immediate action required. And as you can see here on this graphic, the trend that is the purple line at the top of the chart, and what's happened to us in the 2019-20 years sort of needs to be repeated more if we are to hit the 1.5 C and 2 degrees warming targets. Another tool that I thought was rather interesting was had been developed by the researchers at the bottom of this slide here, and they've come up with the idea of a climate clock. And as you can see, their notion is that the next 11 years are absolutely critical. There's a notion of fairness in all of this, that, you know, how are we going to actually allocate these carbon budgets? And do we just sort of take the 440 gigatons and divide it between all of the countries, or is there something about their historical emissions records? So this is a way that international partners are sort of looking at how might we divide these budgets between the nation. And so Professor Tim Jackson at the University of Surrey has taken this thinking even further. And he has looked at, if we just split the global budget between all the nations, then you'd come up with a budget for the UK of around 2.9 billion tonnes. That's the total budget in order to ensure we hit 1.5 C warming. But in 2018, our carbon footprint was 590 million tonnes. So we've got about 5 years on that basis. But he says actually it's even less than that because of our previous historical responsibility for global warming. And he reduced 2.5 billion tonnes of emissions. Now, as you can see here, if we do a straight line to 2020, or try and just to cut in a straight line with a 1.5% reduction, as we have been doing, then we exhaust our budget by 2023. If we just take a straight line to zero emissions, then we actually have a carbon overdraft in terms of our budget, 3 times what we actually have allocated to the country. So as you can see, the last date in his scenario C here, that we can actually draw a straight line from current emissions and stay in budget, is 2025. And actually, if we want to extend the target date to 2050, as it currently is, then we have to cut emissions by 24% each year from now on, which is 140 million tonnes in the first year. And actually in 2009, following the global financial crisis, we cut by 80 million tonnes. So you can see the challenge, what all of this is saying is the challenge is immediate. We need to cut immediately, and we need to do it very quickly right now. And I think the government is beginning to get this. And I think the most recent targets that it's been articulating, cutting by 78% by 2035 against 1990 levels, is encouraging. But the 6th carbon budget really only looks to the years 33 to 37 for limiting greenhouse gas emissions. And I think what I would say here is it's good to see all of this activity. We've got initiatives too, which I've listed at the bottom of this slide. But what I think we really need to see is more immediate action, because these years from now for the next 5 to 6 years are the critical years according to the thinking out there. And I think just a couple of slides here on, well, how much of our energy utilization is coming from renewable sources. And I think what you can see here is it's still, in total energy terms, it's still pretty small, about 10%. But it is encouraging to see between 1990 and 2019 the decline in the use of coal as an energy source. And I think that's been a big success story. But you can see we're still very reliant on oil and gas. And if we just look at, for example, this is a screen grab which I took from a site, Grid IM Kate, which looks at daily electricity power generated and the sources of that. You can see that actually on a typical day, this was yesterday, renewable energy accounted for 22.5% of our electricity generation. Nuclear, I think here was about 15%, and biomass about 7%. So you can see that it's about half. If you take nuclear included, it's about half of our electricity generation. And we've still got to tackle the other half of coming from fossil fuels. We've got 3 coal-fired stations still in action in the UK. 2 actually happen to be located in the Midlands in Nottingham, and these are the decommissioning dates here. We import about half our energy at the moment, and you can see once again that most of this is fossil fuel based, and we've got a long way to go if we're going to decarbonize all of our energy inputs. The big offenders are listed here, very easy, simple graphic from the BBC. I'm going to focus a little bit on transport now for the next few slides, and residential perhaps in terms of heating. Those are the 2 big sort of blocks that I want to look at. And this is where I really want to sort of start considering biomethane as part of the mix. And rather than simply cutting, as the United Nations Environment Programme are saying, I think what I'm suggesting, along with other businesses that I'm working with at the moment, is that we capture the methane emissions, which are so much more damaging than CO2, so that we can have a really positive impact on not only reducing global warming, but actually harnessing it as an energy source. And if we look at, the source energy that are often regularly mentioned as alternatives to diesel and other fossil fuels, all electric I've just been talking about, and somewhere between 20 and 30% renewable any day, and I've averaged it here at 27, but we've got to try and get that by 2050 to 100% renewable. Hydrogen, the other big savior that's often mentioned, is actually 96% based on fossil fuel sources at the moment through the steam reformation of methane. Green hydrogen comes from electrolysis, and whilst that's a really interesting source, there's a massive amount of energy consumed in splitting water into its component elements, and there's also 75% energy loss in that process. So biomethane is actually an energy form that comes from waste products, organic waste materials, so animal, human wastes, organic waste such as food, crop wastes. It's therefore a material, its supply chain is accessed locally rather than internationally through fragile supply chains, such as, for example, in the case of batteries, depleting supply chains that we see in the case of rare earths and cobalts and so forth. But in the case of biomethane, you have a supply chain already here, and at the moment it's not being captured as this slide indicates, and is actually being emitted as a greenhouse gas. So just wanted to look at this circular economy gas in a little bit more detail, with mandatory food waste collections due from 2023, assuming the Environment Bill is enacted into law this autumn. You would collect your food waste, you would then take it to collect it and take it to an anaerobic digester, and the anaerobic digester then simply the bugs in the system, so to speak, simply chew their way through it, produce a gas, and you can then inject that gas straight into the gas grid. And a little bit like electricity, you can look at the proportion of gas that's coming from renewable sources versus fossil fuel sources. And the great thing about biomethane, it's otherwise known as compressed natural gas or bio-CNG, and it's completely compatible with natural gas from the North Sea. You then can use that, link it into fuel stations, depots, and then you can fuel all your HGVs. A kilo of biomethane is equivalent to about a litre of diesel in energy output terms. So as I've said here, you stop a very harmful gas being emitted, you use your waste products, and when the remaining digestate is separated from the gas in the anaerobic digesters, you can use that as a nutrient-rich fertilizer for the fields. And as a result of this, and the fact that this gas is not known very well in all the policy circles that I happen to mix in, when I meet with politicians, they don't seem to know a great deal about it either. I formed the Birmingham Biomethane Cluster, and we have some particularly rich assets in this area in the Midlands, with Severn Trent Green Power, Cadent Gas, Air Liquide, a French company headquartered here, which is building anaerobic digesters around the country, a company called CNG Services and CNG Fuels, responsible for the sort of fueling depots that you can see here. We have one in Erdington, and a whole, with mandatory food waste collections, a big opportunity to run fleets of trucks and buses and trams on biomethane across the country. Severn Trent is one of these businesses that's already producing biomethane. And again, I just wanted to bring to your attention the scale of the energy that they are producing. It's not a 10 years time project as hydrogen really is, but it's actually happening right now. And if Severn Trent Water converted all of the biogas it produces to use to run its plants, and the biomethane which it injects to grid at the moment, it could heat 50,000 homes or power continuously 1,200 HGVs. The core process, as I've already explained, is fairly straightforward, and there isn't really a waste because you use all aspects of the product produced either as fertilizer in fields or energy in your gas to grid process. Food waste provides a really big opportunity. At the moment, you've got Severn Trent Green Power, wholly owned subsidiary of Severn Trent Water PLC, processing 4 million households and producing a lot of energy through a similar process, but in their case, they can set the packaging from the food the food then goes into a digester, the gas comes out, and it then is taken away either for use directly on fuel in lorries, or otherwise goes into the grid, and the digestate then goes back onto the land. And we're throwing away 10.2 million tons of food in the UK. So the business model here is really clear. And rather than putting that food either into energy from waste, incinerators, or into landfill, we can actually use that to create energy. And cities are already doing this across the UK, and these are some of the cities that are using biomethane to fuel their double-decker or their bus fleets. Now, trains are more of a problem, and you know, we've got 38% of the train tracks electrified at the moment, and it's considered too costly to convert the remainder by and large. But we've got a 2040 approaching ban on diesel. So people are rapidly looking and experimenting with hydrogen, electric, and we are you know, in the groups that I'm working with, we're looking at biomethane, as Alex indicated. These are some of the much lighter vehicles that we're looking at producing, drawing on biomethane hybrid engine approaches to get very efficient energy outcomes. And this is a sort of visualization of St. Chad's in Birmingham, but I've taken out the overhead wiring, which you don't need, clearly, with this much lighter, lower cost, domestically produced energy and vehicle approach to solving these problems. And we're looking at the opportunity for retrofit of metros, of trains, of coaches, and all of these, I really wanted to emphasize, all of these vehicles could be run today and are available from OEMs, Scania, Iveco, Mercedes, run on biomethane. The hybrids we're looking at are sort of using very small engines, run on biomethane, 0.9 litre, smaller than a family car, to run this 24-ton, 120-person train shown in the image, with a 1,000-kilometre range, which is about 10 times what you will get on a battery at the moment, leading to much less interruption in service during the day, lower investment, much lower costs on refueling stations, and a big weight saving. It's totally clean air zone compatible, as you can see here, with far fewer particulate emissions and low, very low and compatible CO2 emissions. It's worth just saying a word about CO2. Biomethane is CH4 is its chemical formula. It does have a carbon atom, but of course it's not a fossil fuel one, and this is the big difference. It's
2 minutes, Beverly.
Thank you very much. I'm nearly there, actually, just 2 slides. So here I wanted to illustrate that this is not a sort of 10-year-off project. This is, these are the fueling stations already available across the UK. This is a picture of Erdington, and of course the fact that you can inject this gas straight into the grid and do for gas what we've already done with renewables and electricity. And finally, a slide to show the hundreds of anaerobic digesters across the UK, and to say that with mandatory food waste collections, Severn Trent Green Power estimate in the Midlands, we could actually use another 30 and fuel another 30 anaerobic digesters, providing a carbon neutral source of energy right here on our doorstep today. Thank you very much.
Beverly, thank you for that. That's a fascinating presentation there. Can I ask you a quick question though? The methane, chemical formula CH4, I mean, when you consume methane in an engine, it's still internal combustion, isn't it?
Yes, as you rightly say, the chemical formula is CH4, and it does have a carbon atom, but as a molecule. But the point is that it's one that's already in the atmosphere. So in the formation of biomethane as opposed to methane. So methane is a fossil fuel. You have to take it out of the core of the earth where it's been for millions and millions of years. And when you use the methane, you therefore change the balance of carbon in the atmosphere. And that is a contributor to global warming. But if you use biomethane, you are actually consuming an organic material to create that CH4 that consumed the carbon in the atmosphere to create that gas. So it's not something that you've taken from the center of the earth, released into the atmosphere and unbalanced the chemical mix in our atmosphere at the moment. It was already there. So this is the point I'm really trying to make, is that biomethane is not unsettling the current mix of the atmosphere, but when you use a fossil fuel and you emit that CO2, that is changing the balance of our atmosphere today.
Yeah, but when you burn methane in an engine, it still will lead to some CO2 being produced then.
I know, it is true, there is a CO2 emission, but I'm trying to make the point between a fossil fuel CO2 emission and a non-fossil fuel CO2 emission. And I think, you know, we get very obsessed with tailpipe emissions, if I could just say, because actually when you think about hydrogen, let's say, you've got to actually manufacture hydrogen. It doesn't exist naturally the way biomethane does.
Yeah. No, I suppose what I would take away from this is that methane, as you point out, is a far more dangerous greenhouse gas than CO2.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, yeah, I can see the positive contribution it would make to a greening agenda, I suppose is where I'm going with that. Okay, but thank you for that, Beverly. We may come back to that in Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on then, our next speaker then is Professor David Bailey. David is a good friend to the Centre for Brexit Studies. I've worked with him for a long time, and he is Professor of Business Economics at Birmingham Business School, which of course is the University of Birmingham. He's written extensively on industrial and regional policy, especially in relation to manufacturing and the auto industry. His recent research has been funded by a number of state and private organisations, and he is now participating in a European Union funding scheme called Horizon 2020, which is referred to as Makers, hence the manufacturing connotations there. And of course, he is also editor-in-chief of the journal, the prestigious journal Regional Studies, as well as an editor of policy studies in the Journal of Industry, Competition and Trade. He's been a previous chair of the Regional Studies Association, and he is now chair of the Regional Studies Association Europe think tank and policy forum. So David, I think I asked you to talk around particularly given your expertise in the automotive industry and the shift to electric vehicles. Is that right? We're going to talk around that?
Yeah, and it follows on very nicely from Beverly's excellent presentation. So the link is, as Beverly was saying, something like 27% of our carbon emissions are from transport, and then within that a big part of it is our passenger vehicles, so that the need to reduce our carbon emissions from transport is really critical. And you know, as we heard, the UK has been able to reduce some CO2 emissions in part by stopping burning so much coal and using natural gas. Also, by the way, through deindustrialization. So we've lost the manufacturing, which has gone off to places like China. Carbon emissions are still taking place. So we've actually seen carbon leakage. As we go forwards, we're facing some much more difficult changes in terms of reducing our emissions from our homes, from our food, and from the cars that we drive, for example, and the transport systems we use. So very quickly, I just want to talk very quickly about COVID.
Okay, thanks. Yep, over to you.
Great. The outlook for automotive, electrification. I'm going to throw in something about Brexit and then some big sort of policy issues at the end. COVID, by the way, hugely important, had a massive impact on the auto industry. It was a hit to the supply side and the demand side. Global sales were down sort of massively, particularly in the UK. That was a big cash hit for automakers, and there's been lots of jobs lost in the industry. What we'll see from that, actually, the Chinese players, which the Chinese economy bounced back much more quickly. The Chinese auto players will emerge as even more powerful. It will tilt the balance of favour in terms of the Chinese. We'll also see Tesla, for example, doing very well through EV sales, but also a lot of the support put in place by governments in terms of supporting their auto industry, like in France, has been orientated towards electric vehicles. So it's encouraged further take-up of electric vehicles. So I think COVID, in part, is going to accelerate the shift towards EVs, but also collaboration between firms, because automakers have taken a cash hit. They're going to have to think very carefully about which markets they serve and which technologies they adopt. Increasingly, car firms are saying, look, we're not going to develop diesel any further. We're going electric. They might continue petrol and hybrids for a while, but they're increasingly investing very heavily in electric. So it's, particularly for the European industry, it's electric or bust, basically. We saw a big hit to car sales last year. Plug-ins of various forms in the UK, whether battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids, accounted for about 10% of new vehicle sales for the very first time. Big shift away from diesels taking place. Remember as well, however, Brexit has slowed the UK economy. So even though we may see a rapid bounce back this year and next, I think we'll then be back to relatively slow growth in 2 years' time, with Brexit acting as a drag on economic growth because of the trade barriers that have effectively been introduced. We also saw car production down markedly last year. Big question marks still about the future of some plants in the UK, and in particular the Vauxhall plant up at Elmsmere Port. We know that Honda are closing this year, and Ford are ending some engine production at Bridgend. What we are seeing in the industry is this massive shift away from diesels, and this is a German newspaper from a couple of years ago. Remember, Checkpoint Charlie, you're leaving the British sector. Well, this is saying you're now leaving the diesel sector. So massive shift away from diesels taking place. All the bad publicity about the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal totally freaks out consumers. The industry has failed to put over a convincing case as to why we should be driving diesels. Consumers are concerned about tighter regulation, more taxes, not meeting emission standards. And also, I think Beverly made a very good point earlier. When we really went for diesels in a very big way in the EU, in Europe, it was really focused on tailpipe emissions. Now, actually, when you look at the whole life of a diesel car, diesel is more environmentally damaging to refine. The engines tend to be bigger. They tend to last longer. The overall benefit in terms of CO2 emissions from diesel aren't that great. So actually, it was the wrong policy. So, we've now seen a backlash against that. The car market has shifted back towards petrols. And what needs to happen very quickly, and I think will happen, is a shift now towards electrics and in the short term hybrids. We are seeing lots of car companies effectively now pulling out of diesels completely, but some segments are still diesel dominated. So the big crossover SUV market is still heavily diesel at the moment. Other big thing that's happening at the moment is the introduction of clean air zone. So next week in Birmingham, the clean air zone is being introduced. They're being introduced in different parts of the UK. One of the aims is obviously to reduce air pollution in our cities because air quality is poor. What we're seeing is in Birmingham, if you're driving an older car, so older than Euro 6 diesel or Euro 4 petrol, you'll be charged to drive into the city. I think that will push people further into newer cars and also encourage the take up of hybrids and electric vehicles as well. One of the problems though is that all the different schemes vary. So it's been left to the local level as to what to do. So you think, you're driving a company car, you may find that your car is compliant with one zone but not another. So it's going to be quite difficult for people, I think, traveling around the country. At some point, I think this is going to have to be harmonized. What we are seeing is bans on internal combustion engine vehicles over the next 10 years. UK, as we've heard, has set a ban for 2030 on pure petrol and diesel. Hybrids in some form will be allowed until 2035, but we don't know what form. I don't think the government has decided yet. When the government first announced the ban a few years ago, 2040, they completely forgot about hybrids. First they weren't included, then they were, and then they had to define what hybrid meant. So we're still waiting for clarity on what can be sold until 2035. Now, that's important because I think we will see a lot of, in effect, internal combustion engine vehicles around, albeit in hybrid form, until 2035. But the key thing is that the price of electric cars is coming down very, very rapidly. So the government has now got this ban for 2030 as part of their road to zero. The hybrid ban is 2035. Now, the government is really good at coming out with dates. So it's announced this, but it hasn't really got a roadmap, excuse the pun, of how to get there. The SMMT have called this a date without a plan. Andy Palmer, formerly of Aston Martin, has said, look, okay, yeah, fine, we can have a moonshot, 2030, but if you've got a moonshot, you need a NASA to get there. And that is what has been missing, a detailed map of how we get to 2030, where we can drive electric cars easily, and by the way, hopefully have them made in the UK. There is a danger that we get to 2030, we're importing lots of electric cars because we don't have much of a domestic industry left. So some big issues coming up. Brexit, by the way, is a huge issue as well. We've looked at this in lots of detail at the Centre for Brexit Studies and through the UK and Changing Europe in terms of the issues that Brexit brings in. One point I do want to emphasise is that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the Brexit trade deal, specifies that by the end of 2026, a car made in the UK or the EU has to have a battery from the UK or the EU to qualify for no tariffs. So the race is really on now in terms of building batteries at scale. If the UK doesn't gear up quickly to make lots of batteries that are cheap, the danger is that production will go to where they are cheap. Huge investment taking place in the EU in terms of battery manufacturing. So the UK needs to attract these so-called gigafactories quickly in order to anchor production here in this country. The industry is transforming very quickly. We're seeing shifts towards autonomous vehicles, connected cars, electric mobility, lightweight materials, all sorts of technological innovations. One of the issues with Brexit is that investment, because of the uncertainty around Brexit, was deterred in the UK. We're now having to play catch up in a lot of these areas. So the shift towards electric vehicles is only really just beginning. The first competitive battery electric vehicles have actually only just arrived. Now, at the moment, the sticker price, the upfront price of an electric vehicle is higher than an internal combustion engine car. But as range improves and battery costs fall, and the key kind of point is where battery costs are under $100 per kilowatt hour. Probably doesn't mean much to most people, but at that point, the battery electric vehicle will outcompete the internal combustion engine. It's below 150 now. A few years ago, it was 600. It's down to 300, now about 150. When it gets down to 100, really it becomes a no-brainer. The electric car outcompetes the internal combustion engine. Now, Elon Musk, who is crazy and visionary, is talking about long run, a cost of $5 per kilowatt hour. So there's a long way to go, but battery prices are falling dramatically. The estimates vary as to when the battery electric car will outcompete the internal combustion engine. It's going to be somewhere between 2024, 2027. So the middle of this decade. After that point, there aren't going to be many reasons to buy an internal combustion engine car. So at the moment, battery electrics still upfront more expensive, although running them is very cheap. So whole life ownership may well be cheaper for many people, but the cost is coming down dramatically. Now, the government has still got to keep in place subsidies to help people take up battery electric vehicles, and it's got to put in place the infrastructure to make this doable for people by 2030. So 2020 was really the starting point in Europe, in the EU and the UK, because really tough emission standards came in. Car makers got a super credit if they produced an electric vehicle, which counted twice towards their overall fleet target. So what it means is they started pushing electric vehicles in a very big way. And that's why you've seen such a big range of electric vehicles coming to market. We're seeing much tougher targets in the Europe, which, by the way, we've copied and pasted into UK policy because we need to be compatible with them. We've taken back control. That's going to really drive take-up of electric vehicles, and the fact that the car companies will start making them at scale and really pushing them to market. Now, on that, the UK has really been out of sync. It's been cutting support for people buying an electric car. So it's cut the subsidies from 5,000 to 4,500, 3,500. It was going to scrap them completely, but there's a backlash. They're now at £2,500 subsidy if you buy an electric car. That needs to be kept in place for a few years to give certainty to people in terms of buying electrics until there's price parity. And there's a lot more that governments need to be doing as well. If you look at Norway, where over half of new car sales are battery electric, I think it peaked something like 80% last year. You can often drive in a bus lane if you've got an electric car, park for free, charge for free, and finish your journey using public transport. And they have a fantastic charging infrastructure. It's a no-brainer. We've got to think that way in this country. We've got to think much more holistically to enable people to switch over. And that's what's been lacking from the government. The long-term plan of how we get to 2030. At the moment, we've got a date, but we don't have a roadmap. So in terms of policy, government support on innovation has been good. There's been some support for the new technologies, but not nearly enough. You think about the money available for building battery gigafactories, 500 million, doesn't go anywhere near far enough. We're going to need 8 to 10 of these gigafactories to underpin battery electric vehicle production in the UK. We multiply that 500 million by 10, we'll start to get somewhere. In the US, huge support going into battery electrics and some of the new technologies like autonomous vehicles. And whilst we've seen some support for the charging infrastructure, We've really got to step that up. So I've been driving electric cars now for 6 years. When I first had one, I could guarantee finding a charging point because nobody else had a car. Now I'm competing with lots of battery electric car drivers, and the charging infrastructure has not kept pace. So actually, we need a really rapid rollout of the charging infrastructure. In terms of policy implications, we really need to focus on battery manufacturing. That is going to be mission critical for the survival of the UK car industry. We need an industrial strategy for electric vehicles, which looks at technology, skills, the supply chain, and encouraging consumer take-up. Part of the problem there is the government's decided it's not doing industrial strategy anymore, so big question marks about whether they really understand what's needed. We need a long-term commitment and certainty, which we have in terms of the 2030 target, but we need a much more detailed roadmap of how we get there. And we need to make sure we align standards in the UK with the EU to make sure the UK is an attractive place for car companies to sell battery electric vehicles and hopefully make them here as well. On the charging infrastructure side, we're going to need lots more in the way of charging points. So we've got to dramatically increase the rate at which we put in charging infrastructure in order to make using electric vehicles easy. We need a mix of charging infrastructure. We need fast chargers on motorways, destination chargers for when you're at shops or hotels or other places. You need chargers at home. And for a third of people who don't have drives, you need a charging infrastructure on street whereby you can charge your car. That might mean, as in Coventry, plugs on lampposts or next to them to be able to charge your car. The other point is these charging points need to be interoperable. What that means is you should be able to just turn up, show your credit card and charge your car. At the moment, that's really difficult. I'm a member of about a dozen different charging schemes. So if I'm going somewhere else in the country, I've got to work out what scheme applies locally at the local charging points, join it, get the card or get the app. We shouldn't have to do that. You should just be able to use your credit card. Above all, we've got to think holistically about enabling people to get out of fossil fuel powered cars, dinosaur powered cars, as I put it, into electric vehicles. Just very quickly, Alex, to finish, I've taken this from the BBC website. So on the left, 5th Avenue, New York City, Easter morning, 1900, all horses and carts except for one car, which I think is electric, by the way. 13 years later, all cars. Now, in other words, these changes can happen very quickly. I can't remember whether it was a famous philosopher or John Lennon who said, revolutions often take much longer to arrive than we anticipate, but when they come, they're very quick. So, we've got a revolution that's coming. Final slide. Many of you will recognize this painting. Turner's The Fighting Temeraire appeared in the Bond film Skyfall, by the way. Now, meant to be the country's sort of favourite painting. I think it's on the back of one of our, is it the £20 note or £10 note? I can't remember. What's important about that painting is it's the Temeraire, which played a key role in the Battle of Trafalgar, state-of-the-art sailing ship, state-of-the-art technology at the time, about a decade later being towed away by a steamship. So it was about the passage from wind, sail to steam. It was about a new technology coming. So we've been here before in terms of changing the technologies that underpin our transport. We're about to face that again. That's going to bring big challenges, but also huge opportunities for our manufacturing base, and we really need to seize it in a big way. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, David. Thank you as always. That was a fascinating presentation. Just before we move on to Vicky, can I pick you up on something? When you spoke earlier about the challenge posed by Chinese automotive manufacturers and associated suppliers of parts and components. What would the tariff on a car with a battery not made in the EU be come, 2025? So
tariffs in the auto industry are 10%.
For a complete vehicle, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So in other words, if a car made in the UK or the EU doesn't have a battery from the UK or the EU, those tariffs will apply.
Yeah, so I wonder. I mean, we talk about the Chinese being ultra competitive, and increasingly so. Whether that would really have much of an impact on sales of, say, Chinese-made vehicles or China.
Yeah, that's a good point. So one of the big questions is Chinese are so competitive, particularly when it comes to electric vehicles. They are already setting the global standard in how cheaply you can make an electric vehicle. Now, at the moment, we don't see many of them on the roads here. We see some. They're actually called MG, a brand that we're all very familiar with. And we'll see more in the future. And that, I think, really shows the scale of the challenge. Unless the European and the British car industry changes quickly, the mass industry risks being wiped out by Chinese makers of battery electric vehicles. Now, that's the scale of the challenge we face. So, in other words, we've got to really reorientate the industry towards a battery electric future, including the supply chain, including the skills base, and making batteries as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that the challenge of Chinese auto over the next 10 years as being akin to something of a blast wave, and I think a lot of us don't even see it coming. So,
that's right. Remember, the Chinese government is going electric in a very big way. They're not that competitive in terms of internal combustion engine, and they've got issues in terms of clean air policy in cities. Electric is their future.
Yeah. So on that note, David, thank you.
Thanks.
You. Great stuff. Now, our last speaker then for today is Vicky Price. Now, Vicky is a visiting professor here at Birmingham City University, but she's also Chief Economic Advisor and a board member at the Centre for Economics and Business Research, CEBR. She was previously Senior Managing Director at FTI Consulting, Director General for Economics at the then Department for Business Innovation and Skills, and Joint Head of the UK Government Economics Service. Before that, she was a partner at the accounting and consulting firm KPMG after senior economic positions in banking and the oil sector. So moving away from oil, Vicky, in your own personal journey towards looking at greening and renewables. So I didn't no irony there, but right direction of travel. She's held a number of academic posts, as alluded, and is a fellow and council member at the UK Academy of Social Sciences, a fellow of the Society of Professional Economists, and a companion of the British Academy of Management. So there's an abridged biography for you for Vicky. Without further ado, Vicky, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen with a bit of luck. There we are. So I'm going to open it up.
Okay.
If it allows me to. There we are. Right. Well, thank you very much for asking me to contribute this morning. It was great listening to Beverly and David, with whom I've worked before. And it is, of course, a very important time to be looking at all this. What I want to talk about is, what's happening in the economy and therefore the various trends that are taking place, but also, what is the justification for greening the economy? So the economic case, if you like. So let me just take you through some of what Beverly had already alluded to in terms of the trends that we have seen recently, and therefore whether we can feel optimistic about the future if we are indeed focusing on getting out of fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Well, what we've seen, of course, is that with growth resuming, what has been happening is that the emissions have started to increase again. Beverly showed us the slide of reduction in emissions in 2020, but that is now increasingly getting sort of reversed as the economies grow. And you've seen here, of course, the data on China, which is quite on the upward trend. It's been different in different countries. I think COVID was mentioned, of course, by the previous speakers, and it has hit different countries in different ways. But we can assume that we're all going to be coming out of this at some point in the future. And even the ones which have not demonstrated so far an increase in CO2 emissions will do so pretty soon. Interesting to look at the differences. As I mentioned, the European Union, of course, has seen a longer period of lockdowns, and with it, the reduction in CO2 emissions is carried through. It's getting smaller, that reduction, and will move the other way. But of course, I mentioned China, where there was a very substantial drop in GDP in the first quarter. What is happening, of course, since is that the economy has been on an upward trend and emissions have followed. So yes, of course, renewables are taking a larger share of the overall energy market and a large share of the use of electricity, particularly in the across the world. But the reality is that CO2 emissions are picking up again, and demand for fossil fuels is picking up. And it will do so increasingly if indeed those growth forecasts, which have come out of the International Monetary Fund just recently, materialize. There is increased optimism as to where we might be in terms of growth in 2021 and 2022, a lot more than the optimism that we saw, or the forecast that we saw just 2 months earlier. They were still very positive, but they have been upgraded, mainly because of faster growth in the US. Of course, if you look at the developing world, there are issues right now in India and elsewhere where we might find that because of the COVID outbreaks that have taken place, we might see some slightly slower growth than had been anticipated. But overall, we're assuming quite a substantial pickup in economic activity, and with it, of course, demand for fossil fuel and emissions. And if you look at what is going on right now, I mean, the world is indeed quickly catching up, going back to where we were before. In a number of cases, manufacturing output has gone back to pre-pandemic levels, and we've seen consumer demand increasing. We've seen loads of trade taking place again. The fall in trade last year was a lot less than had been anticipated. The World Trade Organization, if you remember, had thought that trade might fall between 13 and 32% on different scenarios that they had put together. At the end, of course, it fell by about 7 to 8%, and it's been picking up very, very significantly since, of course. And if you look at freight movements, if you look at air cargoes, all that is quite positive. And what you've seen is that the world, by comparison to a year ago, is now consuming a lot more petroleum and liquid fuels, and it's a little bit less than perhaps pre-pandemic levels for the same month, but it's still pretty high. And I've put here just a couple of weeks ago, goes prices for petroleum, for crude oil, and of course gasoline prices have gone up very significantly. And it's one of the reasons why we're getting inflation again in quite substantial sort of figures in the US, and we're also having similar impacts here too, not as high as the US, but certainly energy costs and petrol prices have contributed very significantly to the increases in prices that we've seen across the world recently. And of course, remember that just a year ago, oil prices were negative. Well, now they've gone back to pre-pandemic levels. They vary from day to day. And what we just got, of course, from OPEC is increasing optimism that the vaccine rollout and the rising fuel demand is going to raise global oil demand by nearly 6 million barrels a day this year. And that's despite the crisis which they are noting in India. So the demand outlook remains, quite strong for them. And that suggests that indeed the urgency of doing something about emissions is there, because it looks like the world is carrying on more or less where it was before. Despite all the changes that have taken place, as I said, in the composition of fuels, we still seem to be wanting to emit quite a lot of CO2. But where are we now really, and where do we go from here? And the real interesting question is whether COVID has changed views and has made us perhaps much more conscious of the need to speed up in this process. And there have been some positive signs, without any doubt. We have the US rejoining the Paris Agreement. They have plans to spend $2 trillion on climate change and other infrastructure projects. They intend, just thinking about David's point, to put an enormous amount or number of charging points across the US for electric cars, which would be interesting if it actually happens. And a lot of money needs to be spent on this, and they intend to do so, assuming, of course, they get all this through Congress. In the EU, we have the 750 billion Recovery and Resilience Fund, which is added to everything that's being spent as part of the new budget, the new 7-year budget that the EU has put together. This fund, a lot of that will go for or on climate change projects and also improve the resilience to climate change for various countries. So they're all now bidding for this money, some of it in grants and some of it in loans. There are national plans which are slowly coming to the Commission for them to be approved. And they are actually quite ambitious. And that's, of course, very good news, but it does suggest, if you're thinking of where we might be in the UK as by comparison to what's happening in Europe and the US, we might begin to feel that perhaps we're going to be left behind. But anyway, there are now stricter EU and Chinese targets. We've had announcements of sort of bringing dates forward in terms of net zero and more. The EU is talking about a carbon border adjustment tax that, of course, will have considerable implications for trade, but it will mean that we can't have that carbon leakage that David Bailey mentioned. And we have activists now, and activist investors, of course. We've seen that just in the news today about what's happened at Exxon, where they're forcing new board members in who will care a lot more about reducing emissions. We have the IEA, which has now said that actually in order to meet targets, we shouldn't invest anything as of today, anything new in terms of oil, gas, or coal. And we have the various investors like Aviva identifying the important carbon emitters and then holding the companies to account and hopefully forcing changes in terms of the way they operate. What we have here, of course, in the UK and elsewhere is that businesses, including financial institutions, are increasingly being forced and may soon be forced legally to disclose climate related activities that they have or investments. The UK is intending to follow the EU in the issuing of green bonds to finance climate change investment. It's really interesting. We were talking for such a long period of time about the inability and the unwillingness of the EU to share risk more generally by not issuing Eurobonds. Now, of course, they're going down that route, but of course it's under the guise of green, which is fine, but it's going to be used more or less the same way that had been intended all along, but it does suggest sharing of risks across and a serious intention to look at improving what the EU is doing on the climate front. In the UK, well, perhaps we're falling a bit behind. As I suggested, we've announced this 12 billion initial fund for climate investments with a 10-point plan. Well, as we know, the Climate Change Committee has already said we actually need 50 billion a year between now and 2030. This is the time to do it. The Bank of England has been asked by the Chancellor to include environmental considerations in interest rate policy. They've issued a letter, Andrew Bailey, saying that indeed they will do so. I'll talk in a minute about what it actually means. And there is increased emphasis on sustainable investment. We have seen funds under management in UK, responsible investment funds increasing very substantially, and that is, of course, very good news. To just talk about a couple of those things, on the monetary authorities front, that is accelerating quite significantly, and you can see this is a slide prepared by OMFIF, the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, which is a central bank think tank, that it does affect operations across a range of issues, whether it's in relation to monetary policy, where of course you have to look at the implications of climate variables in macro modeling, whether it's in asset purchases, again, what you do with your portfolio, which way do you bias it, if you like, to look at more green QE, which is quite interesting, and looking much more at sustainability issues. Lending facilities and open market operations, again, you have to be much more careful as to whether perhaps some of the areas that you're supporting are going to be sustainable or will be there in the future as things progress and either climate changes or pressures increase on particular sectors like the oil sector, for example. And of course, when you look at individual banks' exposure to particular sectors which are very dependent on fossil fuels, it does affect the results, if you like, of your stress tests and the way you carry your stress tests as well. And then, of course, what do you do in terms of ensuring that there is proper transparency and reporting in terms of what you as a central bank does in terms of the reporting that goes in relation to disclosing the carbon footprint of one's own operations, the portfolio that one has, and of course, so one's own sustainability in terms of upgrading buildings and making all the premises that you have and the travel-related carbon footprint reduced in the future. So there's quite a lot there, and what we're finding is that quite a lot of central banks are moving in that direction with considerable peer pressure, if you like, but also, as I suggested, tightening expectations from their own governments as well. And as I suggested, that there are all sorts of areas of central bank operations that will be affected, but leading by example, I think, is one, but very significantly cooperating internationally and looking at global regulatory and standards changes that may be taking place is going to be important. And of course, I mean, the Bank of England and others are very involved in this. So the other one I mentioned was the equity funds, sustainable equity funds. You can see here the increase, sustainable equity funds really rising sort of quite substantially, when non-sustainable equity funds, the inflow into them not quite doing it as well. So that's a trend that's actually very positive. And what we've also seen is that there has been a slightly better performance on average for ESG funds, and we've seen that carried through, interestingly enough, through the pandemic. Yes, there have been the odd year when the stock markets haven't done very well, but overall, as we're seeing here, despite the pandemic, ESG funds have performed better. So the interesting thing, again, though, is to look at where exactly those sustainable funds are being, what do they represent in terms of the companies that they're investing in. And the interesting thing is it's mostly, until quite recently, in areas that meet more the S and G, so social and governance issues, rather than the E, which is the environmental. So you can still be an ESG fund, not do very much at all on the green side. But what we've seen is an increase in pressure from shareholders. In particular, it's quite interesting. Again, I mentioned the issue of Exxon. I mean, shareholders, active shareholders, have managed to, hedge funds actually, have managed to appoint their own sort of top people on the board of Exxon. So they were voting for representatives who are quite keen on and ensuring that companies meet quite a lot of what they said they were going to meet in terms of reducing their carbon footprint themselves and becoming seriously green, as they've been saying. Well, BP has been saying this, of course, for quite some time. Similar pressures as Chevron. We've seen a court case in the Netherlands, which is now forcing Shell. Apparently they're going to appeal, or at least that was a suggestion on the news this morning, against that, but it's forcing them to accelerate their net zero move quite significantly. So there's quite a lot going on. So I think that trend will change, and we're going to see much more going into the E side of ESG as well. So just quickly then, what does economics tell us about all this? The justification for it. I mean, we've seen a lot of interest because, of course, of Extinction Rebellion, which has enthused the young, but others as well, but also the realities of climate change that are hitting us. I think economics has been very crucial in bringing the issue to the attention of politicians, and the need to act among the public by just saying what the costs are and the dangers are that are there, not necessarily in relation to the science, which people accept, but in terms of how much more expensive it would be if you left things to the future, when in fact perhaps you can't actually control it if you delay this too much. And we are increasingly aware, and economics has made everyone increasingly aware, that the climate change will have huge repercussions in terms of the environment, food production, livelihood, growth, and so on. And Nick Stern, who worked on the climate change review back in the mid-2000s, did calculate that the potential loss in world GDP caused by climate change could range from 5% to 20% each year, and therefore suggested that one should spend perhaps a smaller percentage of that, 1% of global GDP, to avoid the worst outcome, and 2% of GDP to ensure that temperature stabilize at the acceptable level, which is a 1.5 degrees that everyone is talking about. But one very crucial issue is, how do you convince everyone that you should be spending money now? Because we tend to discount the future in preference for utility now. even the government in UK public policy uses a long-term discount rate for public investment of 3.5%, which does indeed suggest that you don't value anything that happens much later as much as you do now. But of course, that was recognized that this is a problem. What Stern did, which is quite controversial, is assume that the welfare of all generations, current and future, should all be treated more or less equally. So he introduced a social time preference discount rate of just 0.1%, although he used a long-term discount rate of 1.4% for the purpose of calculating long-term costs and benefit of capital expenditure by the public sector. Although it was controversial, loads of papers were written sort of against it and some justifying what he did. It did move discussion, and it did further the understanding that the cost of not acting now is going to be much greater in the future. So you could say, well, the population is going to be much richer later, so who cares? They can do it. Yes, but it might be too late. And there's going to be a lot of suffering in the meantime anyway, because things are happening right now as we are living through it. But of course, we should be aware when we're looking at action that transition needs to be taken with care. Different countries can only deal with things in a different way, particularly if they are quite less wealthy than others. So there had been always this idea that there could be huge transfer of money, and there should be, which hasn't really happened yet, even though it was agreed, for at least adaptation to developing countries from the developed world. So has been a two-pronged attack. One is to look how you can mitigate this climate change, and the other one was how to adapt to it. But confusion still reigns as of today. I mean, we're talking about the climate change review being produced in the mid-2000s, but the reality is that we still argue about this discount rate. But we do at least agree that there is no technically correct intergenerational discount rate. So we have to use value judgments. There is no such thing in this case as a value-free science of climate change. But at least what has happened is that it has elevated all this issue, and a compromise is necessary to square the circle. The Green Book, which has been revised to look more at environmental issues, still uses the discount rate of 3.5%. The Green Book is a treasury book that gives you this discount rate for which you account for all this public spending. But it does allow for a low discount rate for later. So that has much earlier than was the case before. So that's important, but very significant too is to, which actually also the Stern review talked about, is to bring the externalities and correct the market failures that we don't capture at present. Because obviously you can consume as much as you like. If it's not priced in properly, there's no proper carbon tax, and that's a serious problem because you continue to operate that way. So these externalities are not captured either with CO2 emissions or general environmental degradation. So that is now increasingly, of course, accepted as something that needs to be done. And the issue, therefore, is how can we spend enough now in order to make the change that we need? Then a final issue I will mention before I finish is that we are, of course, talking first of all about government policy and investment, but also how production is run and what behavior can do. So touching on a little bit of what David was saying. Well, first of all, the circular economy and change in behavior could also have a role to play. Let me just talk about the circular economy quickly. You can all become considerably more efficient, but the calculations are that even with best available energy efficiency, we're still going to be requiring more energy, which produces CO2 than would otherwise, that is actually acceptable under the 1.5 carbon budget.
Oh, Vicky, sorry, I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, it's my next slide and then I'm finished.
Thanks.
And the circular economy, of course, again, can be using all the waste material that you have in a better way in order to reduce the emissions and the use of actually of those materials and then the emissions that come with it. And that is what has been calculated can happen if it's done properly. And then finally, behavioral change. Will that do it? So we have regulation, investment, we have circular economy, and then behavioral change that could make all this difference. Yes, behavioral change can do it. it's a little bit more difficult to get people to be, to see the material, so the price issues as a reason to change their behavior. The motivation needs to be quite different. There needs to be evidence of the scale of the threat is really what is calculated should happen. Explanation perhaps that those benefits, a bit like we've seen with COVID, can accrue to everyone if you do it right, whether it's from social health and general well-being. So going back to my original question of whether COVID has changed things, I think on the behavioral front, when perhaps we started slightly with greater pessimism, we can say that perhaps COVID has changed this view, and hopefully that will continue in terms of believing that what you do in your private life can also have a wider impact for society as a whole, and certainly for future generations too. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Thank you as always. It's a very sort of stimulating and challenging presentation. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of comments I've seen in the chat forum. One here from David to you. Can or should the Bank of England's target be changed in some way to help green the economy, i.e. should the target only be 2% inflation, or should they have a broader set of indicators? Any sort of quick view there?
Yes, I don't think that the inflation target really matters an awful lot. What matters much more is, what the operations of the Bank of England are in terms of buying, whatever activities they have in the markets, whether it's right now with buying corporate bonds or whether it's with regulating the sort of lending of particular financial institutions. So it's the active participation in the money markets that will matter more, and in the overall sort of lending behavior of itself, but also the financial institutions that it controls and regulates.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to pick up on some questions that have been posed to the panelists. So I've seen some of you already been responding to that. So thank you for engaging with the platform. But I think it's useful to reiterate some of them here for those who've not been looking at that. So something here from Keith. I mean, that may be a comment rather than a question necessarily. What if the UK government spent as much in the next 12 months on decarbonisation as they did in the last 12 months supporting the economy? Anybody want to pick up on that?
Well, that's nearly 300 billion pounds. But that would be pretty good, given that the Committee for Climate Change says 50 billion a year would be fine. But yeah, it would be brilliant.
Yeah, I suppose to me that just recalls Theresa May's said there's no magic money trend. I think, well, there is, depending on what the purpose is, isn't there? Anyway.
I think Vicky's largely answered that in the sense she's showing what's happening in the US and Europe, and we need to be doing more in the UK. And remember as well that the prevailing orthodoxy was of austerity up until COVID. Well, that was the wrong policy. It didn't lead to very rapid economic growth. So we need to think about how much we can spend and how much we can orientate towards greening the economy.
Thank you, David. No, spoken like a good old-fashioned Keynesian there, mate. I'll pick up here on a question from Robin, which I think, David, you touched on already. But again, where do you think the consumer/voter is in all this? Arguably, it is still a second-order issue for them after jobs, housing, health, etc. The challenges and consequences of climate change are still remote to most of them, and governments in the UK in particular respond accordingly. So, David, do you want to reiterate your point there?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really important that government sets a clear direction of travel to underpin, to give certainty to investors. Picking up on what Vicky was talking about, investors need a clear direction of travel, that they know we're going to create markets that are greener, so they invest in sustainable technologies, electric cars, all sorts of other things. Equally, consumers need a clear direction of travel in to say, well, okay, I know I've got to go electric by 2030. And the government has got to help them get there. So there needs to be not only the right price signals, but government intervention to put the infrastructure in place, and a role in terms of education and demonstration as well. So taking the consumer with us, whether it's, for example, in terms of take-up electric vehicles, is going to be absolutely critical. And that's why we need much more of a holistic approach in terms of government policy.
You optimistic or pessimistic there?
It can be done. Norway has shown us it can be done. We can't simply copy their policies, but we can and should think holistically about how we get to 2030 in terms of banning petrol and diesel cars. At the moment, I'm not seeing the government actually do enough. We need to be doing much more quickly.
Okay, Beverly, do you want to pick up on that with any observations?
Thank you. Yeah, very much so. Well, as a local politician myself, sort of in regular contact with our residents around the Malvern Hills area, and actually what I detect is a great deal of concern about the environment amongst our voters, and a desire to see the agenda moving much faster. I think when you get to local government levels, that the sort of levels I'm working at, it's about, you know, the ability and the ability of local government to lever in the investment required. I mean, active travel and mobility we haven't particularly focused on today, but when you think, you know, cities like Copenhagen, 50% of all commutes are done on a bike. It's more northerly latitude than ours. You know, so actually really what excuse have we got? Well, we didn't do it is really, you know, it hasn't been prioritized. Even now, we don't have the budgets to do that. So I think, and my residents will write to me all the time saying we want more money invested in active mobility, but the money isn't there. So the money needs to be there, the investment needs to be accessible, and at the moment it isn't. And I think that actually David and Vicky are right. You know, we need a very clear plan. The residents, the population do want to see more happening, and they want to see it happening now. And those, you know, who do understand the challenges perhaps to a greater extent are very concerned about future generations. So I think there is a desire to see an acceleration of the agenda. There is a desire to see the investment coming to the areas across the UK on really practical things such as active mobility, and to come now. So that would be, yeah, my thoughts.
Okay, thank you there. I'll pick up here on a question that Ada posed. Growth, i.e. in GDP terms, has been mentioned without exploring better sustainability indicators that an economy is actually functioning for what we need. I mean, any views here, panelists, on the utility of GDP in this regard, and perhaps alternative, better measures?
Well, I'll say this has been a debate which has been going on for quite some time, and it is absolutely true that perhaps we don't measure things properly. And it's interesting when you look at GDP. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things, and how you calculate output. Let's look at the National Health Service and everything that happened through COVID. You know, once you start, you know, being able to perhaps treat people better in hospital, and you use less time and less effort to do this, you know, that should in reality suggest an improvement in the quality of your GDP. Instead, sort of looks like it's gone down in a way, because you haven't been using, you know, enough resources, or, you know, pricing it in the shadow pricing system in a way that will increase your GDP. So there are some very perverse things there. But on the positive side, on the GDP, I would say that you still need your growth. You still need to be able to calculate. You still need to see what money comes into the exchequer, if you like, and you can only do that if the economy is doing well. And then you can redistribute it or use it in the right way to achieve the type of GDP balance, if you like, in terms of the sectors and what it does that you really would like to see happen. So you'd still need your growth, you still need your GDP to be able to do the things you need to do, particularly since really technological change may well be what we need to achieve the remaining bit of all the other stuff that we'll be doing. Yes, even regulating the car industry requires, the way you would do it, huge investment in innovation and different machines and all that sort of stuff, and different thinking of how you go from A to B, which wouldn't happen otherwise. But so it is technology that is really at the heart of all this, and for that you need regulation up to a point, but also co-investment. You need the money to be able to get to the right place as well.
David, do you want to pick up there? Yeah, go
on. So I think, just picking up on Vicky, she's absolutely right. I think GDP needs to be in the mix. We need to go beyond that in a sense, and also think about social indicators, environmental and sustainability indicators. So we've got a kind of a basket of indicators that we're saying, right, these are the things that we think are important to us. And if we focus on those, then, you know, there's a very interesting debate amongst environmental economists as whether there should be degrowth, i.e. we're going to have to grow more slowly to do these things. Well, you know, perhaps we might need to be a bit more agnostic about growth, and we need a growth, i.e. let's focus on what's really important. If we can have growth, great. If it means slower growth in GDP terms, but we're hitting all these other objectives, maybe that is sort of more desirable. So we've got GDP in the mix, but we've got a range of other things that we're aiming at as well, I think. And once we start doing that, we can start to look at some of the trade-offs as well. I mean, one of the things which came out of the project I was heavily involved in, Welfare, Wealth and Work for Europe, was that we need to price carbon to make it more expensive, so we economize on it. But we're probably going to have to compensate business in some way. That might be by reducing payroll taxes. So we've got to start thinking about how we orientate society and using some of the tools that Vicky's been talking about in terms of using some of these economic tools to actually make that happen.
Beverly, any thoughts here?
Very much so, thank you. Yeah, I do agree that we need to broaden the measures, and I think this is a point that's made very well in the forthcoming book on the green economy, in particular by contributors like Jonathan Porritt and Tony Juniper, who comment on the fact that we're not measuring the externalities. I think we've referred to this already, but if we're destroying, we're measuring the GDP, but we're not measuring how much we're destroying the environment in creating the GDP. And if we have a mass extinction facing us and no biodiversity being depleted at extraordinary rates at the moment, we've actually got to do something about that. And I think the only way we can do that is to have much more established measures that we understand in business, that we are actually looking at very clearly, that we are reporting on, as Vicky suggested, through the recommendations from OMFIF, which I thought were really interesting, Vicky. And I think most importantly of all, if we are going to have national carbon targets, we absolutely will have to have a carbon tax, because that is going to have to be traded internationally, globally. And I do think an international global settlement will be vital. It needs to happen in the next 5 years, as we can see, because of the urgency of the timetable confronting us all. So I think it's critical, yes.
Yeah, can I just pick up on something that occurred to me? I mean, maybe a stupid question to ask at this stage. David, I might ping this back at you. Do you think cost-benefit analysis then is fit for purpose in terms of trying to capture all the costs of pollution and so on?
It can be built on. So increasingly governments using a approach called contingent valuation in terms of infrastructure projects, whereby people put a value on the environment that's used up, and we certainly need to build that into particularly infrastructure projects. And I thought Vicky's presentation about the discount rate was absolutely spot on, really eye-opening. Of course, we've seen discount rates come down dramatically because of QE in terms of how we measure the pension deficits, but we've not really done that properly, proactively, in terms of actually looking at investment in the environmental field. So looking at what discount rate we use as well in terms of some of these investments is going to be really critical. But Vicky can cover that much more ably than I can. Yeah,
Vicky, just to elaborate on that a bit then.
No, I agree. So everything is sort of taking place. There is no doubt about that. Environmental has been put right at the top now of what certainly the Treasury should be adding to its calculations of this cost benefit. But against that, we have to be quite careful, because at the same time in this country there is the levelling up agenda and the subsidy sort of bill going through, which suggests that maybe some of that cost benefit may not be as, and I think Alex is right to be questioning, may not be as clinically done as we would like it to. So I think I mentioned that you can't have a sort of value-free sort of cost benefit done on the environmental side. I mean, you can calculate the degradations on, but once you start putting values of that sort, it could go the other way too, to support particular projects that may do a lot of harm on one side, but actually could be quite beneficial for particular sectors, so particular areas of the UK. So I think we're in a bit of a difficult situation right now, where there could be a lot of concern about whether any cost benefit that is done correctly, in inverted commas, and takes all these externalities properly into account. And we're going to go through a period when we just don't know how some of those decisions are made. So we need a lot more transparency would be my suggestion in this area. We should be pushing for that transparency to come for any public sector spending that takes place on infrastructure or on, obviously, on the sectors that we've been talking about.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to ask you each for a sort of brief concluding statement, Vicky, so that you continue. Any summary thoughts here now for this morning?
Yes, actually, I started it off being relatively pessimistic, but I think there is so much evidence and so much research that has been done, that is being done, that particularly centers on how we can use technology to get things to really change quite dramatically. So I think it is all there. I'm not necessarily talking about sticking with this type of technology we have at present. So as some people are suggesting, don't start from assuming a static situation here. Assume one where things can change, where we can indeed innovate quite significantly in the future. So the foundation is here. You just need the commitment from government and people's also willingness to look at that as an appropriate way to spend our resources in order to get us there, for that to happen. So I'm slightly more optimistic having listened to Beverly and David than I was at the beginning.
Thank you. And David? Any summary thoughts on today's proceedings?
Yeah, sure. Just coming back to sort of what I said about automotive. So we're going to see more change in the next 10 years than in the previous 100 years in the automotive industry as it electrifies. We've got a date, 2030, but we need a proper plan to get there. And that means taking consumers along in terms of encouraging take-up. It means thinking holistically about not just take-up, but charging infrastructure, reorientating the supply chain, retraining people. Remember as well that that the net zero target challenge is coming at the same time as a fourth industrial revolution. So we're going to have to think about how we train and retrain people throughout their careers. And I think a lot of this, by the way, comes back to things we've looked at before in terms of central government setting overall targets and providing certainty, maybe support for kind of key technologies, but then trying to devolve as much as the decision making as possible down to the local level, where you can bring different actors together to solve problems that suit the locality. So big issue there, I think, in terms of devolving more power as well down to the regional level to actually tackle some of these green issues going forward.
Yeah. Thank you. And certainly couldn't agree more there. And Beverly, lastly?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Really interesting, actually, listening to the presentations. And I suppose the COVID, and particularly the vaccine example, shows that our country actually can get its act together and deliver incredible change in short timescales. And I think, the work of the Cape Bingham Task Force was amazing. And I think we're all conscious of that. And that's the sort of effort we need to see. But I think it requires really big changes, as was demonstrated in that instance, cross public private sector working, collaboration, ability to invest whatever it takes to deliver the solutions. I think we need new measures and transparency, as I think Vicky and David have already pointed out. We need a much longer term view, and we need to drive towards that longer term view with some ambition and will and certainty and clarity. And I think the certainty and clarity is not only important for businesses, which always, of course, are asking for such certainty, clarity, and a longer term view, but for the public who, are going to invest some big, perhaps second biggest investment they make in their cars and the way they move around in these technologies coming up. And I'm really interested in what David said about localism and perhaps, by extension, regionalism, and building on our regional assets and having much greater autonomy to do so. As a local politician, I know the challenges of actually trying to do things locally. Fragmentation is massive. I would personally like to see some reorganization of local decision making, and perhaps in terms of unitary authorities, to actually help us drive more quickly and hopefully efficiently to the conclusions that we need to get to if we are to save the planet over the next decade.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Beverly. And thank you to all of you today for very interesting and stimulating talks. In terms of going forward, we will have another webinar live event at the end of next month, and I'm going to provisionally title it Brexit Health Check, where are we 6 months after having got Brexit done, so to speak. David, you've already made some key points on that one. Might invite you back again in that regard, if you like, potentially all of you. So I'll give that some thought and we'll release further details as we go. Then we will have a hiatus over the summer. We won't run any events in July or August as people tend to be away. And then when we come back in September, if my memory serves me correct, which is a flaky thing at the best of times, we do have an annual conference penciled in. So more details to be released on that. As yet, I'm unclear as to what the format of these will be. Next month will certainly be online. By September, it may well be that we have some semblance of face-to-face or some hybrid setup back in place. But we'll keep you posted as the situation develops, obviously. You know, COVID-19 and any potential third waves notwithstanding. So again, thank you to all. Thank you for those who you know, to our panelists. Thank you, people out there listening to this. Hope this was very interesting for you. Judging by the comment and feedback, I'd say yes, it was. And of course, thank you, Georgia, and our technical support team. So I wish you all good day and have a pleasant rest of the day. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.